control of the Syrian army. Once and if eastern Aleppo is reclaimed by the Syrian army, this may end the terrorist fate in Syria unless the support continues to be provided, like from the U.S. and its regional allies. In this edition of the debate, we'll discuss Syria, the terrorist support from Persian Gulf Arab countries like Qatar. We'll also discuss the use of chemical weapons by the terrorists. To give us an update on what is going down on the ground in eastern Aleppo in particular, our correspondent Muhammad Ali first joins us to relay that information to us. Muhammad Ali, we understand the army has made major advances. If you can expand on that more for us, please.
Yes, the Syrian army during the past 2 days took control of over 12 quarters of the eastern parts of Aleppo, which are under the occupation of foreign-backed terrorists like Al-Nusra Front and Nur al-Din al-Zinki. The Syrian army took control of those areas, the most significant of which were the key areas like Al-Sakhur and Masakin Hanana over there. And as the Syrian army advanced over there, the civilians were able, due to those advances, many civilians, thousands actually, were able to get out of those areas and head to the western side of Aleppo, the safe side, where the Syrian government provided them with all kinds of needs, basic needs, medical food needs, and also temporary shelter centers. Now, this is the most significant advance for the Syrian army since 2012 in Aleppo. It is a heavy loss for the terrorists over there. They are surrounded, those terrorists, by the Syrian army. There is no supply line for them to get any kind of reinforcements or any kind of support, arms, ammunition, or anything. So definitely they have no choices, either to surrender those who are left over there or, of course, be killed by the Syrian army. Now, the Syrian army took control of 20 square kilometers out of 45 square kilometers, which make up the eastern parts of Aleppo. The army continues to advance every hour. The next target for the Syrian army is Al-Sha'ar and also the Sheikh Said. We are expecting, according to the developments on the ground, since that in just 2 days the army took control of almost half of those eastern parts of Aleppo, we are expecting that if not in a few weeks, perhaps days, we can see that the Syrian army taking control of the entire city of Aleppo.
Thank you for that. We appreciate it. That's our correspondent Muhammad Ali from Damascus. Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the debate. We have former U.S. Senate Foreign Policy Analyst James Jatras, who joins us from Washington, and Security Studies program at MIT, Jim Walsh, joins us from Boston. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both. And James Jatras, I'll start with you. U.S. President Barack Obama did say that Aleppo is likely to fall. This was last week. And he said that since Russia and Iran have made their decision to back the Syrian President al-Assad, that it's very hard to see a way in which even a trained and committed so-called moderate opposition could hold its ground. Do you think that Aleppo is going to fall?
Yes, I do. And as regarding Mr. Obama's comments, I think this is what the Brits call making the best of a bad job. That obviously the Obama administration plus our regional partners like the Saudis and the Qataris and so forth have been working very hard to prevent a Syrian army victory over, let's face it, these terrorists, al-Nusra and its allies in Aleppo, and none of it has worked. Now, if we were looking at Hillary coming into the White House in January, maybe they'd feel there was some way to keep the ball rolling until she was in a position to intervene more directly, since all the indications that the Trump administration is not willing to do that, but rather wants to work with the Russian government and even with the Assad government in wrapping this thing up. I can see that there's a real sense of desperation and abandonment on the part of the terrorists in East Aleppo. I'm sure many of them will try to flee and save their lives while they can. And the fact is, it will fall. I don't know how quickly it will be liberated by the Syrian government forces, but this is the edge of a major victory in this war with strategic consequences.
Well, let me get your reaction, Jim Walsh, if I may, on what the Qatari foreign minister has said. He has said this support on these so-called rebels is going to continue. We are not going to stop it. It doesn't mean that if Aleppo falls, we will give up on the demands of the Syrian people. And he said that on the heels of what the U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has said, in which he said he may decide to end Washington's support for these so-called rebels.
Well, I think we need a little context here. First, if Aleppo falls, and it does seem to be strategically an unsustainable project for the rebels there, If Aleppo falls, that means Assad will control the 5 largest cities in Syria. Nevertheless, to the east, the Kurds and Daesh continue to control a large swath of Syrian territory, maybe as much as 40%. So Aleppo will be a devastating psychological and strategic loss, but it's not like all those folks are going to go away. And so I would expect that the fighting will continue. Let me add, by the way, parenthetically, I don't think it's helpful or very smart to just label everyone a terrorist. You know, every government who labels all their enemies terrorists, it's a word that almost has no meaning anymore, particularly in a context when the government of Syria and the Russians have committed war crimes, dropping chemical weapons, attacking hospitals. So, you know, the difference between a war criminal and a terrorist I don't find very compelling. What I think is important is the fate of those civilians there. And I wish that the Syrian government and the Russians and the Iranians on the ground would have taken the words of the UN and created humanitarian corridors. They did not do that. And so I fear for the civilian population, who are not terrorists.
James Jatras, reaction to Jim Walsh.
Well, as far as the bombings by the Syrian government and the Russian government, we know these allegations are being made by Western governments, and precious little proof is ever shown for them. There are claims, of course, of poison gas use by the Syrians. Of course, when you look at the details, it tends to look rather suspicious that it was actually the terrorist forces that were using them. And I do call them terrorists. Yes, I agree with Mr. Walsh. We don't call everybody a terrorist, but you do call terrorists people who are in fact terrorists. If they have a terrorist ideology, a terrorist methodology, they act like terrorists, so they want to create the kind of state that an al-Nusra or Daesh or somebody like that wants to create in Syria, yes, we call them terrorists. Whatever moderate, decent elements there may have been in the opposition have long since abandoned this fight. Many of them have become reconciled in some way to the government. We saw that one of the Trump sons, I think it was Eric, met recently with his Rhonda Cassis, an opposition leader who was part of the initial revolt against Assad and now has become essentially part of the loyal opposition. I think anybody who wants to see a decent, humane, human rights, secular state in Syria has got to realize that they can only happen through a peaceful political process once these people who are in fact terrorists are destroyed. And finally, with regard to bombing by the Syrians and the Russians, I don't think there's any Western ability to point the finger there when you look at Yemen, for example, where the British and the American governments are supporting actual terror bombing by the Saudis in that country.
Jim Walsh, I didn't get an answer from my first question regarding Qatar. So if you can answer that, that'd be great.
Well, I did answer it. I said that I thought Aleppo would fall, that would be a major blow to the anti-Assad forces, but that the Kurds and Daesh still controlled large portion.
That wasn't what I.
That was my answer to that
okay,
question.
that was not exactly what I asked.
The notion that this is all Western propaganda is complete baloney. I mean, I agree. We should challenge all the reports that we get from governments, but United Nations, Doctors Without Borders, the White Hats, there's lots of independent, non-governmental people on the ground who have been continuing to say that there have been the slaughter of civilians at the hands of the Russians and the Syrians. In particular, the bombing of hospitals where there are civilians. And the notion that because people are slaughtered in Yemen, that makes it okay to commit war crimes is ethically challenged, to say the least. I condemn what happens in Yemen, but I certainly don't use that as an excuse to make excuses for governments who slaughter people, slaughter civilians in Syria. That's just, you know, that's really sad.
I'll ask you, James Jatras, what I asked Jim Walsh that I didn't get an answer on, and that was about Qatar. But James Jatras, why don't you tell us if this scenario is accurate? Qatar is a top backer of these so-called rebels, working alongside Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and some other Western nations in a military program overseen by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency that provides these so-called moderate groups with arms and training. Is this an accurate picture of what's going on?
That's accurate in very broad terms, and as we know from some of the WikiLeaks emails, that the Qataris and the Saudis were even providing aid to Daesh. So we know very well that these so-called allies of ours are supporting people that, again, agreeing with Mr. Walsh that you don't call everybody a terrorist, but people who are in fact terrorists, and let's not mince words about it. Now, I think what's interesting here as well is that there have been reports recently that Egyptian forces will be intervening in Syria on the side of the Assad government, that this is causing a rift. Now, the Egyptians and the Saudis, I think we're going to see more and more isolation of the Saudis and the Qataris if they maintain this die-hard support for these terrorist groups, people that they know are terrorists in Syria. I hope it results in their increasing isolation. As far as the Turks go, obviously that's a very complicated matter with regard to their concerns about the Kurds in northern Syria as well as in Iraq, but we also see this estrangement of Turkey from both the European Union and the United States, and their willingness, at least in broad political terms, to talk to the Russians. So I hope there's some way to, if we could say this, to compartmentalize Turkey's role, at least let them back off of this whole regime change nonsense that Ankara has supported. As far as the Saudis and Qataris, I don't know if they're going to wake up and smell the coffee or not, but they need to real quick.
Well, let me ask you, Jim Walsh, about Donald Trump. Now, what has he said? He has signaled opposition to this support that the United States has given the so-called rebels, and he has also indicated that he could abandon them to focus on fighting Daesh, or the terrorists which control land in eastern and central Syria. If he does that, is he going to lose the support that at this point Barack Obama and his administration have had, i.e. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and also Turkey in some respects?
Well, I think on Donald Trump, it's just really, really hard to know. You know, he's never held elective office. He has not developed big policy positions during the campaign. He's contradicted his own statements on occasion on different issues. It seems as if, and here we're just reading tea leaves, it seems as if he would, he says his top priority is Daesh, and therefore the idea of some sort of compromise with Russia and Assad, and he seems to tolerate dictators and authoritarians, you know, or have a higher threshold of tolerance for them, which would apply obviously to Putin and to Assad. So it would seem, in theory, that he would move to a position that was closer to the Syrian government and coordination against Daesh. On the other hand, he's appointed a lot of national security folks who would never do that, you know, in terms of his cabinet and national security appointments. And obviously, he would run into a lot of opposition in Congress on that. So I think it's just really hard to know. Let me conclude by saying that I guess I didn't understand your question about Qatar. I would say, yes, Qatar and Saudi Arabia have certainly funded rebels in Syria, including extremists like al-Nusra and Daesh. And I think the CIA did recruit, unlike the Pentagon program, which really didn't go anywhere because they would only work with so-called moderates, the CIA was willing to work with violent extremists, and that continued for a while. The future of that, I don't know. I mean, that's the broader issue of Iranian-Saudi relations in the region, and obviously that doesn't look very good right now, especially with the change in the Saudi government. It seems to be more aggressive rather than less aggressive. I've said consistently, and I'll continue to say, that the region really needs for Iran and Saudi Arabia to tone down this, because it's going to be difficult to solve any problem in the region if Saudi Arabia and Iran are at each other's throats. So I would hope, and I'll probably be disappointed, but I would hope that there can be some rapprochement there. People don't have to be the best of friends, but they really need to turn down the animosity, because it's infecting the whole region.
Well, I need to also ask you, James Jatras, about Donald Trump. I'll quote him to you, and I'm sure you're aware of this, that he has said he's likely to end support for the so-called rebels based on the New York Times article, and the reason cited, we have no idea who these people are.
That's right, and I think he will follow through with that. It's interesting, too, in one of the debates where he specifically said to the outrage of the foreign policy establishment that Russia is fighting Daesh, Assad is fighting Daesh, the Iranians are fighting Daesh. Now, many of his advisors, including General Michael Flynn, who's taking over as National Security Council Director, is National Security Advisor, they've not been complimentary toward Iran. There are some questions as to what attitude they will take bilaterally toward Iran, but it seems, at least the president-elect himself, is open to the notion that strategically we need to cooperate first with the Russians, Assad, even to some extent with Iran. And again, I would point to the Egyptian factor as a very strong indication of which way he's likely to go. Remember, President al-Sisi was one of the first people to call Trump after he was elected. I think there is an understanding in Cairo which way the United States is likely to tilt once Mr. Trump takes power in 2017, and a lot of people in the region will start moving in that direction. As far as the Saudis go, maybe they can arrive at a more responsible policy there, but frankly, I doubt it. You know, one of the things that really makes me angry on American television is when you hear over and over again, Iran, the world's biggest state sponsor of terrorism. Nonsense. The world's biggest state sponsor of terrorism by far is Saudi Arabia. As far as I'm concerned, that state is beyond repair. I don't know what can actually be done about it. Frankly, I'm not an advocate of regime change, but the notion that Riyadh can behave responsibly, I take with a huge grain of salt.
Jim Walsh, why is the U.S. standing behind Saudi Arabia?
Well, the U.S.-Saudi relationship is an old one, going back decades. You know, the Saudis were fiercely anti-communist during the Cold War. Obviously, they're the world's biggest oil producer. And while the U.S. isn't dependent on that oil for its own economy, that oil matters very much for its allies, particularly Japan and Europe. And I think also that, you know, obviously with the revolution in 1979, and I would say the Iranian foreign policy moderated over time, but in those early years after the revolution, during the Iran-Iraq War, people talked about exporting the revolution, and the president at the time, Ronald Reagan, and Jimmy Carter, were quite nervous about that. So I think it's a variety of factors. There's no doubt that, you know, Saudi Arabia has deep problems of governance, the way it treats women, and its role in the region in supporting Wahhabism. I don't think there's any doubt about that. At the level of nation states, though, mostly it matters on national interest. So, for example, Iran and Syria. Well, you know, Syria is a Ba'athist state. It's not a, you know, Islamic government. It's, you know, there are certainly things that I'm sure the Iranian government isn't really thrilled about with Assad, like the use of chemical weapons, which is a very sensitive topic in Iran, given Iraq's use of chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq War. But states do, you know, conduct policy based on national interest, and it was in Russia's national interest and Iran's national interest to side with Assad rather than the alternative. But it doesn't mean, you know, not all your allies are Sweden and Switzerland, and that's the sad state of international politics.
Regarding another recent development that maybe points to something or another, not too sure how to figure it out, James Jatras, is what the UN Special Envoy for Syria recently said in a message directly, well, face-to-face, I believe, with the Syrian Foreign Minister Walid al-Muallim, and he talked about partition. Northern Syria in particular. Why would the UN Special Envoy come up with something that he would definitely know that would get rejected? Or was there something behind that?
Honestly, I'm not in a position to say. Perhaps it was a trial balloon of some sort. Obviously, if we're talking about the Kurdish presence in northern Syria, there have been discussions about some kind of autonomous zone or something like that. Of course, that's a red flag in front of the Turks if that becomes part of the discussion. And clearly, Damascus would not be happy with that discussion either. But I think just in terms of discussion, a lot of things are going to be on the table. The real question is, especially if, as it looks, East Aleppo is recovered by government forces, we see what then is the game plan for getting rid of the terrorist presence, primarily then in the eastern part of the country. And of course, this then dovetails with the campaign in Iraq against the Islamic State there, Mosul, and moving in a westward direction. So you would hope that at some point adults take over and say, look, we've got to wrap this up. We've got to quash this terrorist threat, which supposedly we all agree on, but in fact, some of the people in our coalition, again, notably the Qataris and the Saudis, are in fact the primary sponsors of.
Well, Jim Walsh, what gain with the Qataris? What gains are they having from this war? What is their intended purpose here?
Well, I think, you know, this war's been going on for a while, and my guess is the intentions early on are different than what they are now. You know, remember, Turkey was a fierce anti-Assad critic and hoped to cause the fall of Assad, and they've sort of reversed policy now. Especially, it was happening even before the attempted coup, and it's certainly been accelerated since then. I assume that initially the Saudis and the Qataris wanted Assad gone. I don't know if that's a realistic goal now, and so that's probably the reason why people are floating different ideas, including partition, though I agree that would be very difficult to do and has its own set of problems. There are no really good choices here. You know, for the Saudis and the Qataris to continue to fund an ongoing war, you know, we're talking about years and years and years and years, a bleeding, you know, horrific sore in the middle of the Middle East. So that's not an attractive option. And so people may be looking for political solutions. It depends, you know, with Turkey having flipped here, with the United States potentially, and I underline potentially because there are a lot of roadblocks, but with the Trump administration potentially shifting its position, it may be that if the Saudis and the Qataris see themselves as isolated, they'll be more in a mood to
I got to unfortunately jump in. I do apologize, Jim Walsh. Let me ask James Jatras for a final. I'm sorry about that, Jim Walsh. James Jatras, in conclusion, 30 seconds. Do you think that the U.S., as it said, could stop the war in Yemen if they wanted to, that they could do the same in Syria?
Absolutely. I think in both cases. Clearly with the Saudis and Qataris in Syria, we'd have to lean on them very hard, especially the Saudis. Obviously, we'd have to lean on the Saudis hard when it comes to Yemen. I think that would actually be a tougher thing to do, given how deeply the Saudis have dug themselves in there directly, not through proxies, as they have in Syria. But I think that's really where the real stern talk has to come if we want to wrap these things up.
Thank you for that. Former U.S. Senate Foreign Policy Analyst James Jatras there, and Security Studies Program at MIT, Jim Walsh, spoke to us from Boston. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, cover that way, and the entire team in the Capitol, Tehran is goodbye.